Well, good morning, everyone. It's wonderful to be with you today as we open up God's Word together, and particularly as we look at this passage from John 14. I wonder if you have ever been going somewhere and discovered along the way that you've been following the wrong directions. For a man, well, for me at least, this is close to being one of the worst experiences in life, especially if you then have to ask someone for directions. And these days we tend to rely on sat-navs and mobile phones to get us where we want to go, but they all rely on having the right address or postcode. Well, the week after Catherine and I got married, we attended the wedding of a very close friend. We were 1 week into our honeymoon, but had delayed our holiday abroad to attend this wedding. And in the rush of our own wedding, we forgot the invitation, but fortunately, our friend had given us a postcode to get to the church. We set off and arrived in good time for some lunch nearby, about half a mile from the destination, which was being displayed on our sat-nav. With 20 minutes to go, we drove the last half mile, and with "You have arrived at your destination" ringing in our ears. Unfortunately, the destination was definitely not a church, and there was no sign of Edding wedding. Don't worry, we thought, we have another wonderful modern invention, the mobile phone. We will just simply ring somebody. Unfortunately, as we should have expected, phones were switched off and no one answered. They were all preparing for the wedding. We were truly stuck. We had no idea where the church was. We didn't have any directions. We didn't know the way. Now, I must admit, I'm not the best person to be around when I'm either lost or running late, and we were doing both. Here we were, first week of our married life, halfway through our honeymoon, and we were running in and out of different churches trying to find this wedding. It was a total 4 weddings and a funeral situation. So in a moment of despair, with Catherine close to tears, we prayed. Probably should have done that straight away, and decided to head in the direction of the nearest town, about 15 miles away. 10 miles along the road, we happened to pass a church with a woman standing outside in a fancy frock. Might this be it? Might this be the right church? I parked and Catherine ran towards the church and asked the women, was this the wedding for Becky and Tim? Yes, hooray it was. Catherine and I rushed into the church. We had made it, even if we were 45 minutes late. See, for us, we thought we had the right postcodes. We thought we had come to the right place in good time, but our details were wrong. We had the wrong postcode and no idea how to get where we wanted to be. Well, as we come to this passage in John 14 this morning, we see the disciples feeling completely directionless, with no idea of how to get to their destination. Having been led by Jesus for the last 3 years, they suddenly have no idea about what is going to happen. They lack direction about the future. But actually, it's much deeper than that. The context of this passage is the Last Supper, the final Passover meal before Jesus is crucified. And we are in the midst of some really heavy stuff. Jesus has, in an amazing act of humility and service, just washed his disciples' feet, demonstrating what it means to be a true servant and follower of Jesus. The disciples must have been awestruck as their teacher, their rabbi, the Son of God, knelt down and washed their feet. Jesus then goes on to predict his betrayal, and not by an enemy or an outsider, but by one of the disciples, by one of them. He then goes on to tell them that he's only going to be with them a little longer, and that where he is going, they cannot come. He tells them to love one another, and that by this love, everyone in the world will know that they are his followers, his disciples. By the way that they demonstrate love, they will show their identity. And finally, he tells them that Peter, one of his most reliable, trusted disciples, despite saying that he would lay down his life for Jesus, will in fact disown and deny Jesus, not once, but 3 times. So take a moment to consider how the disciples must have been feeling. And then ask yourself, have you felt similar before? Confused, shocked, maybe betrayed, let down, desperately worried, fearful? If you have felt like that, it's likely the disciples were feeling the same. And so Jesus, in this context, speaks these words. Do not let your hearts be troubled. You believe in God. Believe also in me. These words that he spoke not only to the disciples then, but to every follower and disciple of Jesus since. And he speaks them today. In the midst of COVID-19, do not let your hearts be troubled. While some are dying and others fear death, do not let your hearts be troubled. When jobs are lost, do not let your hearts be troubled. When relationships break down, do not let your hearts be troubled. When the children are struggling with being at home and you're worrying about their education, do not let your hearts be troubled. When mental health starts to overwhelm, do not let your hearts be troubled. When financial troubles come, do not let your hearts be troubled. Hearing these words of Jesus, and in fact speaking over them, over ourselves and over one another, is deeply powerful. And I want to say to you this morning, do not let your hearts be troubled. Believe in Jesus. But Jesus doesn't leave us there. When we read on, Jesus gives us an answer to the why. Why should we not let our hearts be troubled? It's the question that those disciples were asking, and maybe you're asking today. It's all well and good telling me not to let my heart be troubled, but why? Well, Jesus answers by pointing. Jesus answers by telling the disciples not to focus on the now, but pointing towards a heavenly future. My Father's house has many rooms, he says. If that were not so, would I have told you that I'm going there to prepare a place for you? And if I go and prepare a place for you, I will come back and take you with me, that you also may be where I am. Jesus here uses the same Greek expression previously used for the temple. For the Jews, the temple was the place where heaven and earth met. It was God's presence here on earth. And so Jesus uses these words to reassure the disciples. I will take you to my Father's house, and there is space for everyone. I'm on my way to prepare a room ready for you, and as the Message translation puts it, to the place where heaven and earth will meet eternally, and everyone is invited. Now, this preparation isn't saying that the house has not been completed or that it's in disrepair. Instead, Jesus is saying that what is not ready is the way to the house. Jesus has not done the final act that will make it possible to get to God's house. Jesus is going to prepare the way. His act on the cross, his death and resurrection will make it possible to enter God's house. But it's a house where heaven and earth will meet in this perfect, everlasting home for all of God's children. But like Thomas, who's always asking the best questions, I think, you might feel like asking, Lord, we don't know where you're going, so how can we know the way? Jesus goes on to make it abundantly clear that this access can only happen through him, the way, the truth, and the life. He is the way to the everlasting home. And of course, the Bible only gives us a glimpse of what this everlasting home might physically look like. But what the Bible does give us is the nature of the place, the impact of the place, the values, the character of this place. As Jesus says in verse 11, at least believe on the evidence of the works themselves. The glimpse or picture of this everlasting home is given not just by Jesus' words, but also by his actions and his miracles while here on earth. When the dead were raised to life, when the blind saw, when the deaf heard, when the lame walked, and lepers cleansed. That was heaven meeting earth. But also when the poor, the prostitute, the tax collector are welcomed, when the outcast and marginalized are restored, when he stood alongside the woman caught in adultery and poured out grace. That was heaven meeting earth. This was the new order, the new rule and reign being manifest, heaven coming to earth. And throughout his life, Jesus points towards a future reality which is further described in our passage from Revelation 21, when he will completely and totally wipe every tear from their eyes, where there will be no more death, or mourning, or crying, or pain, for the old order of things, the old order, the rule, the reign of this world will pass away. In addition to being a traveller on the road, Jesus also asks us to be a signpost to others. He says in verse 12, "Truly I tell you, whoever believes in me will do the works I have been doing, and they will do even greater things than these, because I am going to the Father." So as he told his disciples, so he tells us to demonstrate the nature of the new heaven and the new earth, but here and now. To participate in the transformation of lives, setting the captives free now, today. To see healings taking place, the blind giving sight, the deaf being able to hear now, today. The outcast welcomed in, the poor restored to new life, now, today. Because when we outwork this in our world today, it acts as a signpost for what is to come in full, completely in the future. These things act as a signpost to Jesus, the way, the truth, and the life, the one and true and only guide who promises to lead us from this life to the next. And so this morning, my encouragement to each one of us would be, in the midst of the hurt, the pain, the situations of our world, and as we celebrate VE Day and 75 years of peace in Europe, we look to an eternal home and fix our eyes on Jesus, the Good Shepherd. Jesus is the only one who is able to guide us through this life into the next. My challenge, though, would be to ask, how are you acting as a signpost to others? As we are Jesus' hands and feet in this world, as we outwork his kingdom, as we see heaven coming to earth through our actions, we become a signpost to point others towards Jesus and towards our eternal home. Amen.